My name is Timothy Grieve-Carlson. With my friend and colleague, Learned Foote, we've been given the pretty straightforward task of putting a bow on this weekend for everyone. I'm happy to report that we do have all the answers, and we'll be sharing them over the next 30 minutes. Not really, obviously. What we are going to do is we're both going to speak for about 10 minutes in the spirit of something that Jacques Vallée said on Thursday night, that perhaps the future of research into UFOs and other phenomena is the consideration of how they might help us ask deeper questions, how they relate to wider social, cultural, spiritual phenomena, and how the UFO itself might be, if not the key, some kind of guide to understanding some of these bigger questions. And for myself, I can't speak for Learned, in the spirit of Anne Strieber, I promise that I'm not going to conclude with a conclusion. I'm going to conclude with what I hope is, if not a good question, an okay question. But it begins with a story. Has anyone heard of Jacques Vallée? I'm just going to read a few pages of something I've written recently, a doctoral dissertation, and it begins with a story that Dr. Vallée, with his co-author Chris Albeck, found in an almanac from Philadelphia. It was too late in the evening for many to see it, as it shone across the night sky of Philadelphia in July of 1829. But a few lucky night owls caught an extended glimpse. One witness wrote to the editor of Hazard's Register, a local almanac and news magazine, to describe the event. Mr. Editor, a meteor of rather singular character made its appearance in the heavens last night, between the hours of 11 and 12 o'clock. As a great number of your readers, owing to the lateness of the hour, had not an opportunity of observing it, I shall endeavor to give some description of it. The author of the letter went on to give a thorough description of the object, which they identified as a rather singular meteor. Almost immediately, it becomes clear that the object seen over Philadelphia that night was not a meteor in any common or contemporary sense of the word. It arose apparently from the neighborhood of the Schuylkill, wrote the correspondent, referring to the area just west of the city where the Schuylkill River proceeds towards the Delaware after converging with the Wissahickon. A long trail of light, like that of a shooting star, was seen to follow it in the beginning of the ascension. In addition to its trail, the object emitted, quote, large sparkles, end quote, that descended slowly in its wake. In the author's description, then, the object seems to arise vertically from somewhere in the area where the rivers meet, emitting both a trail of light and falling, sparkling objects beneath it. The movement of the object was also very much unlike the linear path of a meteor. Its motions were rapid, irregular, and wavering, like the fluttering of a kite or the rocking of an air balloon. The object seems to tremble then and sputter in the air, and the references to kites and balloons seem to suggest a windblown pattern to its movement. Its color was no less extraordinary than its motion. Its appearance, quote, was of a deep red color and remarkably brilliant, seemingly of about half the size of the moon, end quote. As it arose, the object passed over the city of Philadelphia and crossed the Delaware before it descended in a fashion no less dramatic than its ascension. It appeared but an inconsiderable speck, scarcely discernible, writes the correspondent, and then it descended with astonishing velocity until within a short distance from the horizon, where it remained awry for a few moments. Suddenly, it became exceedingly large and brilliant. Sparkles again separated from the main body and descended as before. It soon after became dim and disappeared behind the trees. With its trembling motion, clear pattern of terrestrial ascent and descent, shining displays of arrayed lights and sparkles and rich color, the nocturnal object of 1829 was not likely a meteor, but it was certainly a beautiful night to be out in Philadelphia. As extraordinary as the object was, the readers of Hazard's Register of Pennsylvania would have been aware of a number of similar events in the skies over their state over the previous few years. Indeed, just a few months earlier in the year 1829, Hazard's ran a description of the aurora borealis for its readers. In one column, the author seems to refer to the frequency of such phenomena as common knowledge to a contemporary Pennsylvania audience. Quote, the frequent appearance of these lights, so unusual within our latitude, is probably within your recollection. The kinds of phenomena that Hazard's calls auroras are, perhaps expectedly, just as strange as their meteors. Their descriptions include enormous perpendicular columns of white light which arrange and rearrange themselves as they cast themselves across the sky, and shimmering dark clouds which move through sky-wide arches of brilliance. And perhaps most telling of all, the auroras of 19th century Philadelphia continued to appear throughout the bright light of day. Again, it seems unlikely to our contemporary sensibilities and meteorological knowledge that the northern lights shone over Kensington in the broad daylight of the 1820s, but these are the sources we have. Sources like hazards can be confounding to the contemporary reader, who might be forgiven for assuming that the skies of the 21st century are free of such strange brilliance. If one cares to look, celestial phenomena like those reported in Hazard's Register can be found throughout early American publications, especially those written for an audience of farmers, who largely based their planting schedules on close and careful attention towards the movements and patterns of the stars, the phases of the moon, and the spinning signs of the zodiac. The small rocky and metallic bodies that pass through the Earth's atmosphere and occasionally strike the surface of the planet were a matter of severe scientific debate among the Enlightenment intelligentsia in Europe and the Americas at the turn of the 19th century, in the decades leading up to Hazard's Philadelphia meteor. In fact, the acceptance of the meteorite, which is the rocky body itself, as opposed to the meteor, which is the rather poetic technical term for the far more easily ignored visual event in the sky which accompanies its falling, as a scientific fact, only dated to 1803, a few decades before Hazard's published its account of the object over Philadelphia. By 1804, meteors were largely and begrudgingly accepted as a fact by the transatlantic scientific community. This rather belated acknowledgement was the subject of an editorial in the Edinburgh Review, which reflected on how such a widely witnessed and well-known celestial phenomena could have been rejected by scientific authorities for so long. Why were so many well-supported testimonies, quote, being treated by the naturalists with such perverse incredulity, end quote, asked the review. In other words, why did the scientific community seem to willingly blind itself to a phenomena so obvious, and even here the word obvious doesn't feel obvious enough, after the fact? As Simon Schaefer has written, scientific acceptance of meteorites was hindered specifically by the social status of the people who reported them. From the elite perspective of professional scientists, knowledge of meteorites relied on, quote, plebeians, who were reckoned superstitious, end quote. In the 18th century, as surely as today, there were deep class divisions and outright animosities between forms of knowledge. Enlightenment meteor denial was the denial of a specific form of knowledge rather than the simple factual denial of the reality of a light in the sky. Rare celestial events required an environmental knowledge, a knowledge which was slow, observational, locally and temporally situated, and thus largely reliant on rural people who were often poor and thus lacked access to formal education. Hence, meteors were the exclusive knowledge domain of superstitious plebeians. This kind of environmental knowledge was almost uniquely unsuited to the sciences, especially the localization of observations and the temporal need for a phenomena to repeat itself in order to be experimentally verified. Despite its extraordinary appearance and its singular character, the sources documenting the 1829 manifestation over Philadelphia do not suggest that it was an event of any religious interest at all. Rather, for all its mysterious beauty, it was only ever a meteor. This interpretation, as simple as it was or it seems, represented a tectonic change in the human experience of the environment. An interpretation of a similar event in previous decades can illustrate the significance of this transformation. One manuscript depiction of a celestial event in southeastern Pennsylvania in 1769 includes the following text. And I'm translating here. Up to the judgment, up, do not miss it. A comet star of very pale color appeared in Pennsylvania in the year 1769 in August. You people, ask yourselves what this star may mean. These two extraordinary celestial events took place in roughly the same area of the world, separated by only about 60 years. But within that separation was a vast gulf of understanding, of knowledge, of meaning that the people made of their cosmos. And while it is tempting for a historian to describe this shift as one from simple religion to simple science, it is worth pausing for a moment to reflect on the operational differences between these two forms of knowing. The first manifestation, the pale comet of 1769, was an event which demanded, above all else, an interpretation. Specifically, the author writes, ask yourselves what this star may mean. The pale comet called for introspection, for personal reflection. It called for an essentially hermeneutic process of knowledge. The meaning of the comet was not a question for experts somewhere else or for the natural sciences. Rather, it was an introspective process with a largely personal outcome, in this case, a kind of moral self-determination. The second event, the 1829 manifestation over Philadelphia, was an event which, at least to the authors of Hazard's Register, did not even demand an active explanation, much less personal reflection. So wide and so deep was our understanding of the cosmos. The identity of the object as a meteor, as an identified object, was so embedded in its appearance that it seems like the Philadelphians who saw it, at least so far as we can tell from reading Hazard's Register, may have ignored a genuine celestial anomaly. With only a few years separating these events, the separation between the ways of knowing them seems so vast. Why? Thank you. Learned Foote, everyone.
My name is Learned, and I am really grateful for the opportunity to talk to all of you today. And I'll be talking a little bit about my dissertation research in the context of this event for opening the archives of the impossible. And I have to say, first of all, that I first came to Rice 6 years ago after reading Jeff Kripal. That was the main motivation. And the first books I read were Mutants and Mystics, Authors of the Impossible, and The Serpent's Gift. But some of the things that really connected to me within those books were the works of Jacques Vallée and Whitley Strieber. So I'll be asking in the material that I'm looking at some questions framed by that context. But I also want to say that I did the GEM program at Rice, and there's a number of really great faculty who have also influenced the way that I think. And I want to mention people in particular who perhaps might not agree with the things I say, but have been influential for how I think about them. In particular, Claire Fanger, April DeConnick, Anthony Pinn, Nikki Clements, and Anne Klein. I have a dissertation workshop now with Claire Fanger, so when I give this to her, I'm very interested to see what she says and how she responds. So this is a dialogue, it's an open-ended process that I'm trying to engage in. I'm going to be talking about what does the impossible mean in the context of Buddhist philosophy. And I'm going to be looking at a few different things: reincarnation, gender, and religion, and then turn my attention finally to the category of the sky dancer, or kanjoma, in Sanskrit dakini. So my dissertation is a translation and study of the autobiographies of a Tibetan Lama, whose name was Adzum Drukpa. He lived from 1842 to 1924. You can see a picture of Adzum Drukpa right here. And these are the collected works of Adzum Drukpa, which Rice awesomely purchased. These are 8 volumes. They're hundreds of pages. And in my dissertation, I'm only focusing on the first 2 books within this collection, which is thankfully only 344 pages. These are works that have never been translated into English before. And the 2 books that I'm looking at consist of the autobiography of Adzum Drukpa, as well as the biography of Adzum Drukpa that was written by Gyurme Dorje, who is the son of Adzum Drukpa. So first of all, the question is, what counts as impossible in Buddhist philosophy? In the context of modern secular universities and mainstream US culture, there are many everyday facets of Tibetan social life that would be considered impossible. For example, Tibetan Buddhist cultures rely on reincarnation, in particular on the concept of the tuku. For many centuries, when a lama or guru has died, Tibetan Buddhists have developed mechanisms for identifying the next reincarnation while they are still a child. This happened to Adzum Drukpa when they were a child, and it is still a widespread social practice today. I remember the first time that I went to Nepal to study at Rangjung Yeshe, and I went to a restaurant to sit with some other American students, and I started asking them questions. What do you really think about reincarnation? Do you really think it is possible? And this to me felt like an important question. But the problem and it was also a weird question to ask because there were tukus all around us in the sense of the social context. So the problem I faced could be described as the insider-outsider problem. How did I understand a society and culture that I did not belong to? Why did something so ordinary in Tibetan context seem impossible to me as an American graduate student? And just to give a sense of how this affects me now, that was 6 years ago. And this coming Saturday and the next, we are having a Zoom session with Anne Klein, where Adzam Gyaltse Rinpoche, who is the reincarnation, the identified reincarnation of Gyurme Dorje, will be answering questions that I have about the text. So there's kind of this point where it doesn't really matter what I believe anymore. He's the person who's sort of carrying the institutional memory of this person forward and becomes a way for me to engage in an understanding of the text. So there's the moving from the idea of, is it real, to how do you engage the phenomenon as it's existing. I want to give another example that is reincarnation, that was the first one, about how what is possible or impossible can be socially conditioned. And I'm going to be paying attention now to the category of gender. In much of mainstream US society, including the right-wing government here in Texas, there is a firm belief that human society has two genders, male and female, and these categories are considered to be stable and fixed. For right-wing conservatives, this is what they would like to believe is possible. However, this explanation with its two genders model is a simplistic explanation that does not account for concepts of gender across many different cultures, including Buddhist cultures. As queer, trans, and feminist scholars such as B. Shearer and Carol S. Anderson have shown, Buddhist cultures and scriptures describe multiple genders, not just male or female, but also maning. There is also descriptions in the Pali monastic code that describe a shifting and fluid context where nuns transform into monks and monks transform into nuns. This is not a magical or mystical event, and certainly not an impossible process, but rather simply something that happens. The monastic codes say, okay, when this happens, fine, here's what you do. If you have a monk that has become a nun, you take her to live with the other nuns. In the book Unbounded Wholeness, which was written by my advisor Anne Klein, as well as the Bun Lama, Geshe Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, there's the example of Lishu Daring, who also changed genders. I've been especially interested in this question in the context of the autobiographies of Adzam Drukpa, who also was said to wear moche, or woman's clothing. And this is kind of a question about how does gender apply across different contexts. And there's a lot of difficult problems when you raise this question. Even queer theorists have pointed this out a lot. Even if we take terms like queer, trans, even gender itself, these are arising from English context, and there's serious risks in putting them into other social contexts. So this is a major problem that always needs to be paid attention to. At the same time, if you don't have conversations about gender, if you don't have conversations about queer theory, it's easy to assume that the mainstream sort of dominant perspective within our culture, which I would describe as cisgender dominant, there's an assumption that that's how everything works. And because it works here, that's how it's working also in Tibetan Buddhist contexts. And once I started reading queer theory and reading scholars of sexuality and gender, that enabled me to see a side of Tibetan Buddhist social life and also ask questions to people that I knew that really complicated that process. So this is just to say that what is impossible and what is possible really depends on what you're looking at and what the frame of your analysis is. So that is the point on gender I wanted to make. The next thing is about so what I just said about reincarnation, gender, it really applies to almost every single aspect of interpretation and translation. So for example, I'm in the Department of Religion. In Tibetan, there is no word for religion. There is Nangpa, which means insider, and this is contrasted often with the indigenous tradition of Bun. There is Chiluk, which means system of Dharma, and Chising Zungjel, which is the connection of Dharma and politics. And these terms can be compared to religion as it is understood in Western contexts, but something is always left out. In religious studies, we often think about religion in Schleiermacher sense, these internal subjective experiences that are private. This is not really inherent in the Tibetan words that you might say could be applied to the concept of religion. So as scholars such as Talal Asad point out in Genealogies of Religion and Tomiko Masuzawa in The Invention of World Religions, it is not clear that this category of religion even applies outside of the Christian and secular dominated context in which the term emerged. But from the perspective of religious studies, these disjunctures are useful because they allow us to ask questions about how it is that religion was constructed as a category in modernity and why it is so often considered to be separate from science. They also invite us to explore how does the concept of chi, or dharma, function in Tibetan contexts. So I think, okay. I've talked about gender and religion, and now I'm going to move into themes that maybe seem more relevant to this conference, which is deities, gods, and sky dancers. And my comments about gender and religion have been addressed by many eminent scholars in Buddhist studies, but these next comments are a little more controversial. So in order to give myself a little bit of bravery, I'm going to quote somebody here who might be considered an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. And this is the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. In the New Physics and Cosmology, Dialogues with the Dalai Lama, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2004, the Dalai Lama was quoted as saying, "Of course, the paradigm of the fascination with extraterrestrial life is an image of weird extraterrestrial beings coming into contact with human beings on Earth. But from the Buddhist point of view, given the understanding that there are sentient beings in different realms of experience, even within this world system, there are probably more explanations that could account for phenomena which would otherwise be deemed considered mysterious. Even though there's no totally compelling scientific evidence of aliens coming to planet Earth, there are many individuals who have had very anomalous experiences, people who seem in every other way sane. There doesn't seem any way to account for this within the standard scientific paradigm, but the Buddhists might have an easier time taking these people seriously." These comments provide me with a jumping off point. The Dalai Lama's words, it seemed to me, seem potentially resonant with the analyses of Jeff Kripal, Jacques Vallée, David Halperin, and that there tends to be skepticism of the extraterrestrial hypothesis combined with a deep interest in anomalous experience. I don't think it's very surprising that the Dalai Lama is interested in anomalous experiences and encounters because they have been fundamental to the development of Buddhist philosophy. And I'm moving here to an image of Tsongkhapa, but I'll go back a little further. The early Mahayana philosopher Nagarjuna is said to have retrieved the Prajnaparamita scriptures after journeying to the land of the Nagas. The Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra, another early Mahayana text, is translated into English as Sutra on the Meditative Absorption for Encountering Face-to-Face the Buddhas of the Present. And according to the contemporary scholar Thupten Jinpa, the founder of the Dalai Lama's own tradition, Tsongkhapa, who's depicted here in the cloud, he himself learned to communicate with the Buddha Manjushri, first through a medium, then through a disciple who saw visions of the deity, and finally through visions of the deity himself. So there's this process of learning to communicate with deities that is central to Tsongkhapa's practice and Tibetan practice more broadly. However, there would be serious issues if we take these kinds of accounts and jump to a term like UFO, for example. And I found this out myself when I was in Nepal. I would do this during my colloquial classes with people. And, after you're done talking about how do you get to the restaurant or what is emptiness, I might ask a question more to my interests. And one time I asked somebody, I was like, so UFOs, like, what's the deal? What do you think about them? And the person I was talking to was a young man in his 20s who lived in Nepal, and he started laughing. And then he started humming the X-Files theme. Which is an important point because it shows the frame of reference that's typical for the UFO phenomenon, which is very mixed up with Western pop culture. So when I say UFO, he's not thinking about his own context, he's thinking about this TV show, the X-Files. So that's interesting. Another point I'd like to make is talking to another person, I asked questions about lights and objects, and he told me that he saw when he was a child lights moving across a hill, and his parents told him that they were witches. They were caused by witches, and he was very afraid of the lights in that regard. So that's kind of a story that maybe sort of provokes some sort of memory of experience within him that's more relevant than the X-Files question. So I found a couple of accounts in my studies that seem resonant of abduction experiences, and perhaps more so resonant of earlier fairy lore than the modern UFO iteration. So I'm going to consider an example from Namkhai Norbu, who was himself born in eastern Tibet, and is actually recognized as a reincarnation of Adzom Drukpa. He died in 2016 or 2018, I forget. He wrote an ethnography of Tibetan nomads in which he shared the following story. And I'm just going to read what he said. When we arrived in the territory of the nomad tribe called Arikza, a rather strange event had just occurred. Gulu, a 12-year-old boy, had gone to graze his flock of sheep on the mountains, but he had not returned when evening fell. 6 days later, shepherds noticed him walking on the flank of the mountain, sacred to the local god, AOTI. When they found him, he told the following tale. I was sitting on a flat, clean stone and had just poured my yogurt into a cup and was slipping it slowly when I felt someone pulling me from behind. I turned around and saw a terrifying person with long, curly black hair wearing felt clothes. He said to me, I am AOTI's shepherd. Your father killed 2 of my Goa antelopes. For this, you must come with me as a forfeit. He tied a rope around my neck, and I can no longer remember what happened from that moment on until my return home. I only have glimpses of myself, at times, in a great felt tent with brocade hangings filled with delicious food and drink. And it's interesting to note that Namke Norbu is himself an outsider to this lifestyle that's being described. He's not a nomad. He's born in Durje in the settled area. So he's kind of an outsider to this thing himself. And he doesn't give any other explanation. He said, this is what happened to the child. We asked him the questions, and this is the strange story they told. So we have here a story of a shepherd god or the shepherd of a god who disapproves of hunting. And when the boy disappears for a full week, his experience involves traveling in a great tent. And these are what are typically used to travel in the regions by the nomads, including by Adzum Drukpa. So the next thing I want to talk about is sky dancers. And this is these are Dakini, a class of generally feminine entities who at first, in earlier contexts, were considered ordinary spirits. But in tantric developments, they came to be considered awakened beings. And I'll just talk about them for a second here. So Dakini is the Sanskrit term, sky dancer is how I'm translating, and the actual word itself is kanjoma. And just to look at the word ka at the very beginning, there's not really a clear distinction between sky and space. So if somebody were to appear, they could appear from the sky or they could appear from space. And that could be just as well the sky outside as it is you're in a dark room for a week and something appears out of space. So there's a lot of flexibility to this term. And then there's the word the jo, which is the sense of they're going to the sky. I'm treating that a little bit poetically as sky dancer. It's been translated that way before. And ma, a feminine particle, indicating that these are generally feminine entities. So sky dancers, they help in the work of the terten, or the treasure revealer. And the terten reveals terma, or treasure, which are said to be objects, scriptures, practices that were hidden in the 8th century by Padmasambhava. Adzum Drukpa, the biography I'm translating, was himself a terten. And now I'm going to give a quote of my translation from the autobiography when he first meets a sky dancer. This comes relatively early in the autobiography. He says, day and night without rest, I performed by myself more than 1,000 detailed and concise offering rituals. After midnight on the 15th day, I was exhausted and slept a little. In a state where experience and dream were not separate, there was a woman in the sky without support, squatting like a blacksmith, without standing ornaments and clothes. So this is interesting. We could perhaps think of this in terms of anomalous states of consciousness. There's the description of experience and dream being mixed. And he goes on to have a set of conversations with this woman who identifies herself as Ting Barma, and they have a conversation. It goes on to have a series of increasingly disturbing visions that I'm working on translating right now, where these entities multiply into multiple forms, and they taunt Adzum Drukpa with seductive dances. And he starts to wonder, are these really Dakinis, are these really awakened beings, or are they rather women who pose as sky dancers? So another thing to point out here is that this treasure revelation that's being described here is not just something that Tibetans believe. And this is kind of how people sometimes describe, but this is a problem because these were already controversial and contested practices, even in their own social context. As Andreas Doctor describes, Adzum Drukpa's contemporary Mipam wrote a commentary on treasure revealers in which he warned about delusions and frauds and so forth. And this contestation also goes back to the emergence of the Mahayana and the Vajrayana scriptures, as Don Lopez describes in Elaborations on Emptiness. There have also been Tibetan accounts, by the way, from Adzom's contemporaries in the 19th century who criticized the practices of identifying reincarnations. So you have, even within these cultural contexts, ways of examining revelation, treasure revelation, reincarnation that could be very critical. So it's not just Tibetans believe XYZ in some magical fashion. So it's important to recognize that there's a range of opinions that develop in Tibetan societies concerning sky dancers and claimed encounters with sky dancers. And I'm going to end with an image and talk about the image for maybe just a couple of minutes. So this is a 17th century image of the famous Tibetan yogi Milarepa. And I'm going to talk about this image in the context of what we have just described. And this image is too complex to analyze in a lot of detail today, but I want to point to some intriguing things about it, what it depicts. So the central figure here is Milarepa. You can see his skin has turned green from eating nettles so much. This is a classic part of the story as it developed over the centuries. And you can also see he has his hand to his ear. And you can see the disciples right behind him, one of which also has his hand to his ear, sort of imitating the guru. And this is Gampopa, the person who developed the tradition of Milarepa over the centuries. So this is the first piece, which is the disciples and Milarepa. And I want to point out that these are really elaborately beautiful. This is a close-up of the landscape just above Milarepa's head. So you can see the flora and fauna, the incredible detail and complexity of this image, as well as Milarepa himself, which has, I think, a very human, but also a saintly quality with the halo, a real sense of expression. And then I want to move here to talking about, and I'm thinking Tingbarma, but that's the entity from Adzom Drukpa. This is Seringma. So this is a mountain goddess that is appearing to Milarepa. And what she is doing is she's trying to distract him. And she's casting up these magical apparitions that appear above him, and sort of as a means of perhaps breaking his focus. And this... But Milarepa, knowing the nature of reality, is not fooled by these kinds of apparitions. And it's interesting, so just to jump back for a second. So now we've seen kind of like the parts of the picture, and the parts that I'm really thinking about are we have Milarepa, we have the goddess, we have the apparitions, we have the disciples, all within this complex picture. And this is actually a really prominent theme in Buddhist literature that I think really gets to the heart of some of the concerns of the tradition over millennia. It also goes back to Buddha Shakyamuni, who is also said when he was sitting preparing to be awakened, that he was deceived by the demon Mara, who also cast up delusions, and Shakyamuni had to sort of see through these delusions as a way of understanding the nature of reality. But it's a little different in this context because Mara is pretty negative in Buddha Shakyamuni, whereas in this context with Seringma, she is an ally to Milarepa. She becomes his consort, and she, when Milarepa passes on, she takes on half of his relics. So we see in this relationship with these magical apparitions, and I was showing this to my boyfriend yesterday, and he was like, how can you go to a UFO conference and talk about apparitions and delusions? It'll be very upsetting to people. And what his impression was is that I was trying to focus the attention on kind of the human dimension, the disciples and Milarepa. But I actually think the whole image here is really important. It's this entire encounter and the means of assessing what the encounter means that I think is significant in the context of not only the stories of Shakyamuni becoming awakened, but also the stories of Milarepa, and also this dialogue with Dakinis and the sky dancers that's going through the heart of the autobiographies of Adzom Drukpa. The point of potentially comparing in the way that I have suggested to fairy lore or to UFOs is definitely not to suggest that this is a space alien that's summoning illusory UFOs at all, nor is it to say that if we really want to understand UFOs, we should all become Buddhists or Buddhist studies people. That's not the point. As Jeff writes in Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal and the Sacred, the point is not to reduce one false register to the other true one. it is to confuse and destabilize both registers. In my view, some of these kinds of analyses can help to disrupt the comfortable and rationalistic boundaries of Tibetan Buddhist studies and secular Buddhism as it has emerged within the context of Western universities through a deeper and more critical investigation of religion, gender, and deity. Thank you.